Welcome to English Story Vault. Get ready for an exhilarating adventure. Let the story begin. California Governor Gavin Newsom delivered a powerful evening address, directly challenging President Donald Trump's perceived overreach of power and our act often termed abuse of power. This strong condemnation stemmed from recent events in Los Angeles, where days of widespread protests erupted against federal immigration raids. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE agents had conducted a series of raids in Los Angeles, resulting in multiple arrests of individuals suspected of being undocumented. These actions fueled public outrage, leading to numerous street demonstrations. While the majority of protests remained peaceful, some escalated into violence, causing property damage. Federal agents responded with crowd control measures, deploying tear gas and other specialized tools to disperse the protesters. President Trump viewed these developments as a grave threat, prompting his decision to deploy federal assistance. He ordered a significant military presence to Los Angeles, including California National Guard members and U.S. Marines, totaling approximately 4,700 soldiers. Governor Newsom vehemently opposed this federal intervention. He argued that the deployment of soldiers exacerbated an already volatile situation, making the streets more dangerous. He accused President Trump of prioritizing conflict over public safety and undermining both individual freedom and democratic principles. Newsom urged Californians to carefully consider this perilous moment, asserting that President Trump's actions were steering the nation in a dangerous direction. He pledged California's unwavering commitment to defending its citizens. In response, California initiated legal action, filing a lawsuit to halt the military presence in Los Angeles. The state contended that President Trump's order was unlawful, asserting that the state, not the federal government, held authority over the National Guard within its borders. Both Governor Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass confirmed they had not requested federal military assistance, believing local police and state forces were sufficient to manage the situation. Despite this, President Trump proceeded with the deployment, igniting a significant public and legal confrontation. This clash underscored a profound disagreement between California's leadership and the U.S. president regarding power dynamics and crisis management. Federal agents from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, conducted multiple operations within Los Angeles targeting individuals living and working without legal documentation. Over several days, these agents conducted raids at various locations, including businesses, leading to numerous arrests. On one particular day, 118 individuals were apprehended in Los Angeles, sparking widespread anger and concern across the city. Many perceived these arrests as unjust or excessively harsh, leading to hundreds of people gathering in the streets to protest the ICE raids. Local activists and families impacted by or vulnerable to arrest joined the demonstrations. While most protests remained peaceful, characterized by vocal and sign-based expressions of dissent, some areas unfortunately experienced escalating violence. A small faction of protesters caused property damage, with reports of burned vehicles and objects being thrown at buildings. In response to this violence, federal agents monitoring the protests intervened, employing tear gas, which caused burning eyes and coughing, and stun grenades, which disoriented crowds with loud noises and bright flashes to control the unruly elements. President Donald Trump addressed the situation in Los Angeles, characterizing the protests as a serious threat. He asserted that the protesters were obstructing federal government functions, including immigration law enforcement, and described the unrest as an act of rebellion against the law. President Trump emphasized the immediate need for decisive action, warning of severe problems and escalating unsafety if left unchecked. He stated that federal forces were essential to protect federal workers and property, and to prevent what he termed mob rule from prevailing in Los Angeles, unequivocally stating he would not permit the protests to impede federal operations. President Donald Trump issued an order dispatching the National Guard to Los Angeles. Although the National Guard typically operates under state authority, the president can federalize them in certain circumstances, citing specific legal provisions. President Trump declared the situation in Los Angeles a severe crisis, labeling the unrest a rebellion, and asserting that protesters were obstructing federal officers' duties. thus necessitating military intervention. Beyond the National Guard, the Defense Secretary also deployed U.S. Marines, active-duty federal troops, resulting in a substantial military presence in the city. President Trump federalized 2,000 National Guard members and sent them to Los Angeles, while the Defense Secretary deployed over 700 U.S. Marines, bringing the total military presence to approximately 4,700 soldiers and Marines. This deployment occurred rapidly, despite the explicit objections of California's leaders. Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass both stated that local police forces had the situation under control and unequivocally expressed their desire for no federal troops in their city. They believed President Trump's order was unnecessary and potentially unlawful. California responded decisively to President Trump's order to deploy soldiers to Los Angeles by initiating a legal battle. The state government filed a lawsuit against the federal government, announced by California Attorney General Rob Bonta. California immediately sought an emergency injunction from the court to halt the federal military presence in Los Angeles. The lawsuit also demanded the return of California's National Guard soldiers, whom President Trump had federalized, asserting that the state governor should retain control over state guard forces to manage local situations effectively. California's current primary legal argument asserted the illegality of President Trump's order. State lawyers explained that federal law permits presidential deployment of federal troops in a state only under specific, severe circumstances, such as a foreign invasion or a major rebellion that completely incapacitates local police. California argued that such extreme conditions were not present in Los Angeles, asserting there was no foreign invasion, and that while challenging, the protests did not constitute a rebellion that entirely halted law enforcement. The state also contended that President Trump failed to properly consult with Governor Newsom before deploying the Guard, as typically required by law. Governor Newsom also strongly condemned the federal actions, calling President Trump's actions a brazen abuse of power and accusing him of militarizing the streets of a major American city. Newsom believed the deployment was an escalation that worsened, rather than improved, public safety, and warned of potential harm to civil liberties and fundamental freedoms. California vowed to continue its fight against federal actions through all available means, including the courts. The lawsuit argued that President Trump's order was unlawful and violated the U.S. Constitution, which reserves significant powers to the states, including control over their National Guard, protected by the 10th Amendment. California aggressively defended its state rights and control over its forces, arguing the president lacked the legal authority to deploy troops without state agreement, particularly when state leaders believed the situation was under control. The lawsuit represented California's official and forceful rebuttal to the federal deployment, using the legal system to protect state authority and citizens' rights. They sought a court order for federal soldiers to withdraw from Los Angeles. This legal challenge marked a highly significant development in the conflict between California and the Trump administration. In the United States, strict rules govern the domestic deployment of military soldiers, designed to maintain a clear separation between the military and civilian law enforcement. The Posse Comitatus Act, a foundational law, generally prohibits the use of federal Army and Air Force personnel for domestic law enforcement, reserving them for foreign conflicts or national defense. Their use in arresting civilians or controlling crowds is typically disallowed. However, exceptions exist where the president can deploy soldiers, including the National Guard or active-duty military, for federal service under specific legal provisions, such as in cases of invasion, rebellion, or when federal laws cannot be enforced without military intervention. President Donald Trump cited Title X of U.S. law as the basis for deploying federal troops and the National Guard to Los Angeles, asserting that the situation constituted a rebellion and that troops were necessary to protect federal officers, buildings, and public safety. However, numerous legal experts questioned President Trump's justification, arguing that the protests, despite some disruptions, did not meet the legal definition of a rebellion. Concerns were raised about the dangerous precedent of using soldiers against protesters, particularly regarding civil liberties, given that the military is trained for warfare, not civilian engagement. Conversely, supporters of President Trump defended his authority as commander-in-chief to use forces to protect federal interests, arguing that the troops were essential to prevent greater chaos and that without them, the situation would have deteriorated significantly. The current situation draws comparisons to historical instances of presidential military deployment. The Insurrection Act, an old law, permits the president to use the military domestically during certain major crises and has been invoked to suppress tax protests and protect African American citizens from violence. A notable precedent is the 1992 Los Angeles riots, where President George H.W. Bush deployed federal troops, critically, at the request of the California governor. In contrast, President Trump's current deployment to Los Angeles is occurring despite Governor Newsom's explicit opposition. The last time a U.S. president deployed troops to a state against the governor's wishes was in 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson intervened to protect civil rights marchers. These historical examples highlight that domestic military deployment typically occurs in response to severe national problems, often with state government concurrence. However, critics argue that the current protests do not constitute a major, national crisis, and that the president's rationale for deploying troops is insufficient. They worry that using soldiers against peaceful protesters infringes upon the right to free speech and assembly. President Trump's past campaign rhetoric about deploying the military to Democrat-led cities to quell unrest lends credence to the view that current events align with his previous statements. While the Insurrection Act broadens military powers, including civilian arrests, many critics argue that the current protests do not meet the criteria of a genuine rebellion warranting such action. Historical comparisons help frame the current situation, raising questions about the appropriate exercise of presidential power and the permissible scope of military involvement in domestic affairs. Governor Newsom's pronouncements ignited a diverse range of public opinions. His stance garnered support from many Democrats and civil rights organizations, who praised his defense of civil liberties and criticized the militarization of immigration policy. Some protesters also echoed concerns about democracy being imperiled. Conversely, President Trump and many Republicans strongly disagreed. The White House defended the president's actions, with one official accusing Newsom of aiding those engaged in violence. President Trump claimed his soldiers saved Los Angeles from being destroyed, and that Newsom was exacerbating the problems. Numerous Republican politicians in Washington also backed the president, with some advocating for legislation to explicitly affirm presidential authority to deploy troops in situations of unrest. Some television and online news outlets were critical of Newsom's speech, citing technical glitches in the video and suggesting he was merely seeking attention. Some media personalities mocked him, implying he was incompetent even at simple video production, and suggesting his presidential ambitions were fueling his fear-mongering. Residents of Los Angeles also held varied perspectives. While some protesters and city leaders appreciated Newsom's acknowledgement of their concerns, others expressed reservations about his strong rhetoric. One protester remarked that the city was not burning, questioning the necessity of President Trump's troop deployment. Protests against federal immigration policies also erupted in other U.S. cities, including New York and Chicago, demonstrating a broader resistance unaffected by the Los Angeles events. Even Texas Governor Greg Abbott placed his state's soldiers on alert in anticipation of potential protests. Political analysts expressed concern over the escalating conflict between Governor Newsom and President Trump, likening it to historical state-federal disagreements over power. They viewed the situation as a manifestation of tensions regarding the balance of power and the system of checks and balances in American governance. Ultimately, fundamental questions regarding the Los Angeles events persisted. Governor Newsom framed the situation as a battle for democracy, arguing that President Donald Trump's actions fundamentally challenged American values. Newsom sought to galvanize nationwide support, and California's lawsuit continued, with courts facing the complex task of determining the legality of President Trump's troop deployment. Historical precedents offered limited clear guidance, as older laws invoked by President Trump were formulated in different eras, and their applicability To contemporary protests was debatable. Legal experts presented conflicting interpretations. Some affirmed the president's authority to protect federal sites with troops, while others argued that the relevant law applied only to specific situations like invasion or genuine rebellion, which they contended were not present, and also required prior consultation with the governor, which did not occur. The courts were tasked with evaluating these arguments. As the legal battle unfolded, a No Kings movement emerged, advocating for limits on executive power and gaining traction beyond Los Angeles. The deployment of thousands of soldiers to Los Angeles incurred substantial costs, reportedly exceeding $134 million, prompting questions from many, including Governor Newsom, about funding and accountability. The clash between California and the Trump administration was a profound event, potentially reshaping future dynamics between state governors and the U.S. president.